Hey guys, tonight we begin with something extraordinary. Something that's been hiding in plain sight for nearly 2,000 years. We're talking about the Roman Empire, but not the version you learned about in school. Not the gladiators, not the emperors, not even the conquests. Tonight, we're diving into the secret technology that made it all possible. The innovations so advanced that when Rome fell, humanity forgot how to build them for over a millennium. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, adjust your pillow, and let the world slow down around you. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. It's the year 126. You're standing in Rome, looking up at the Pantheon. The dome above you stretches 143 feet across, and there's a hole at the top, the oculus, letting in a perfect circle of sunlight. What you're looking at is still, to this day, the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. Not the largest ancient dome. The largest dome, period. Modern engineers with all their computers, all their steel, all their technology, still haven't built a bigger one without reinforcement. That should tell you something. The Romans weren't just building monuments. They were solving problems that wouldn't be solved again until the Industrial Revolution. And some of their solutions? We're only just now beginning to understand them. Let's start with something that sounds boring but changed everything. Concrete. I know. Concrete doesn't sound exciting. It sounds like the stuff your driveway is made of, the stuff that cracks after a few winters and needs replacing every couple of decades. But Roman concrete? That's a different beast entirely. Walk along the harbor of Caesarea in modern-day Israel. Look at the ancient Roman structures still standing in the water, still doing their job after 2,000 years of waves, salt, and storms. Now drive through any modern city and count how many concrete buildings from the 1960s are already crumbling, already scheduled for demolition. The Romans built things that were meant to last forever. And in many cases, they actually did. For centuries, this was a mystery. Archaeologists and engineers would examine Roman concrete, scratch their heads, and wonder how structures built with primitive tools and no modern understanding of chemistry could outlast everything we build today. They knew the Romans used volcanic ash, something called pozzolana, mixed with lime and seawater. But that couldn't be the whole story. Then, in 2023, researchers at MIT finally cracked the code, and what they discovered was beautiful in its simplicity. The Romans weren't just mixing concrete. They were creating a living material, something that could heal itself. Here's how it worked. When the Romans mixed their concrete, they did something that modern engineers thought was a mistake. They used a process called hot mixing, combining quicklime with volcanic ash at extremely high temperatures. This created small chunks of lime scattered throughout the concrete, little white inclusions that early researchers thought were signs of poor quality control. They were wrong. Those lime chunks were the secret. When cracks formed in Roman concrete, as they inevitably do in any structure, water would seep in. But instead of making the problem worse, the water would dissolve those lime chunks, creating a calcium-rich solution. That solution would flow into the cracks and crystallize, literally gluing the concrete back together. The concrete healed itself. When MIT researchers recreated this process and deliberately damaged their Roman-style concrete, then exposed it to water, the cracks completely sealed themselves within 2 weeks. 2 weeks. No human intervention. No repairs. The material just fixed itself. Think about what this meant for Roman engineering. They could build massive structures, aqueducts stretching for hundreds of miles, harbors exposed to constant wave action, buildings supporting enormous weight, and they didn't have to worry about maintenance the way we do. The structures would maintain themselves. This is why the Pantheon still stands. This is why Roman aqueducts still carry water in some parts of Europe. This is why harbor installations built 2 millennia ago are still functional. The Romans had created a material that was, in some ways, superior to anything we use today. And then, when the empire fell, the knowledge vanished. For over 1,000 years, humanity forgot how to make concrete that could heal itself. We're only now, in the 21st century, beginning to understand what they knew, and we're trying to recreate it, to bring back this lost technology, because even with all our modern science, we haven't improved on what they achieved. But concrete was just the beginning, the foundation, if you will. Because what the Romans built with that concrete, the structures they created, the problems they solved, that's where things get really interesting. Rome was a city of over 1 million people. Let that sink in for a moment. 1 million people living in a city 2,000 years ago. That's a population density that wouldn't be matched in Europe again until London in the 1800s. And every single one of those people needed water. Not just a little water. Romans were obsessed with cleanliness in a way that wouldn't be seen again until the modern era. They bathed daily. They had public fountains on every street corner. They had massive bath complexes where thousands of people could wash, socialize, and relax. The baths of Caracalla alone could accommodate 1,600 bathers at once. So where did all that water come from? The answer is one of the most impressive engineering achievements in human history: the aqueducts. Rome had 11 major aqueducts by the height of the empire, bringing in over 300 million gallons of water every single day. That's more water per capita than many modern cities provide. And they did it without pumps, without electricity, without any power source except gravity. The Aqua Claudia, completed in the year 52, stretched 69 kilometers from its source to the city. At its highest point, near the Palatine Hill, it rose 32 meters above the ground, a massive stone structure carrying millions of gallons of fresh water into the heart of Rome. But here's what's truly impressive: the engineering precision required to make this work. Aqueducts work on a simple principle. Water flows downhill. Start with a source at a high elevation. Build a channel that slopes gradually downward, and gravity does the rest. Simple in theory, extraordinarily difficult in practice. The gradient had to be perfect. Too steep, and the water would flow too fast, eroding the channel and causing damage. Too shallow, and the water would slow down, allowing sediment to build up and eventually clog the system. The Romans aimed for a gradient of about 1 in 5,000. That means for every 5,000 meters of length, the aqueduct would drop just 1 meter. Try to visualize that. Imagine building a channel that stretches for miles and miles, through valleys and over hills, across rivers and through mountains, and keeping that gradient consistent to within a few centimeters. Now imagine doing it without laser levels, without GPS, without any of the surveying equipment we take for granted. The Romans did it with something called a chorobates, essentially a long wooden beam with a water channel on top. By ensuring the water in the channel was level, they could establish a horizontal reference point. From there, they could calculate the slight downward slope needed for the aqueduct. It was painstaking work. It required teams of skilled engineers, years of planning, and incredible attention to detail. But it worked. And it wasn't just about getting water to Rome. The aqueducts had to maintain consistent pressure, distribute water to different parts of the city, and handle varying demand throughout the day. The Romans developed a sophisticated system of distribution tanks, settling basins, and pressure-reducing valves. They understood hydraulics in a way that seems almost impossible for their time. They knew that water in a closed pipe would rise to the same level as its source, allowing them to use inverted siphons to cross valleys. They knew how to prevent airlocks, how to manage pressure surges, how to keep the system running smoothly year after year. The Pont de Gare in southern France is a perfect example of this engineering genius. It's a 3-tiered aqueduct bridge, standing 49 meters tall, carrying water across the Garden River. The top tier, where the water channel runs, has a gradient of 1 in 3,000. Over the entire length of the aqueduct, 50 kilometers from source to destination, the total drop is only 12.5 meters. That's precision engineering on a scale that wouldn't be matched for over 1,000 years. But the aqueducts were just the delivery system. What the Romans did with all that water, the infrastructure they built to manage it, that's another marvel entirely. Every Roman city had a complex network of pipes, made from lead or terracotta, distributing water to public fountains, bathhouses, and wealthy private homes. They had valves to control flow, overflow systems to prevent flooding, and settling tanks to remove sediment. And then there was the sewage system. The Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's first sewage systems, was built in the 6th century before the Common Era and is still in use today. Still in use. A sewer system that's been functioning for over 2,500 years. It collected runoff from the streets, waste from public latrines, and overflow from the aqueducts, channeling everything into the Tiber River. It was large enough that maintenance workers could walk through it, and it was built so well that it survived the fall of Rome, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and every era since. The Romans understood something that medieval Europe would forget. Cities need clean water and effective sewage systems to survive. Without them, disease spreads, populations decline, and civilization crumbles. When Rome fell, European cities lost this knowledge. For over 1,000 years, people threw their waste into the streets, drew water from contaminated wells, and died from diseases that proper sanitation could have prevented. It wasn't until the 1800s that European cities began to rebuild the kind of water and sewage infrastructure the Romans had mastered 2 millennia earlier. But water wasn't the only thing flowing through Rome. Information was too, and the way the Romans managed communication across their vast empire was just as impressive as their aqueducts. An empire is only as strong as its communication network. You can conquer all the territory you want, but if you can't send messages, move troops, and coordinate across vast distances, that territory becomes impossible to hold. The Romans understood this better than any civilization before them, and they built the most sophisticated road network the world had ever seen. At its peak, the Roman road system stretched over 400,000 kilometers. That's enough to circle the Earth 10 times. These weren't dirt paths or rough trails. These were engineered highways, built to last, designed to move armies, merchants, and information at speeds that wouldn't be matched until the railroad age. The Via Appia, built starting in 312 before the Common Era, was called the Queen of Roads. It stretched from Rome to Brindisi, a distance of 560 kilometers, and parts of it are still in use today. You can walk on stones that Roman soldiers marched across 2,000 years ago. But the roads were just the physical infrastructure. The real innovation was the cursus publicus, the imperial post system. Established by Augustus, the first emperor, the cursus publicus was a state-run courier service that could move messages across the empire at astonishing speeds. Relay stations called mutationes were placed every 15 to 20 kilometers along major roads. A courier would ride from one station to the next, swap horses, and continue immediately. This meant messages could travel day and night without stopping. A courier could cover over 80 kilometers in a single day, and urgent imperial dispatches could move even faster with multiple riders working in relay. To put this in perspective, a message from Rome to Londinium, modern-day London, could arrive in about 10 days. That's over 2,000 kilometers across multiple provinces through different climates and terrains in less than 2 weeks. Medieval Europe, 1,000 years later, couldn't match that speed. It wasn't until the development of the telegraph in the 1800s that information could move faster than the Roman courier system. But speed wasn't the only advantage. The cursus publicus was also secure. Couriers carried official seals and documents proving their authority. They had priority on the roads, access to fresh horses, and the backing of imperial law. Interfering with an imperial courier was a serious crime. This allowed the emperors to maintain control over an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. They could send orders, receive reports, and coordinate military campaigns across thousands of kilometers. And it wasn't just official messages. The road network supported a thriving commercial system. Merchants could move goods safely and efficiently, knowing that the roads were maintained, that there were inns and way stations for rest, and that Roman law protected travelers. The roads themselves were engineering marvels. They weren't just flat surfaces. They were multi-layered structures designed to handle heavy traffic and last for centuries. First, workers would excavate a trench, sometimes over a meter deep. Then, they'd lay a foundation of large stones, the statumen. On top of that, a layer of smaller stones mixed with mortar, the rudus. Then a layer of gravel and sand, the nucleus. Finally, the surface layer, the summum dorsum, made of carefully fitted paving stones. The surface was slightly curved, higher in the middle than at the edges to allow rainwater to drain off. Drainage ditches ran along both sides of the road. Milestones marked distances, and the roads were wide enough for two carts to pass each other comfortably. This wasn't just construction. This was engineering with an understanding of geology, drainage, traffic flow, and long-term maintenance. The Romans built roads that could handle the weight of marching legions, heavy cargo wagons, and constant traffic year after year, decade after decade, century after century. And they built them everywhere, in Britain, in Gaul, in Spain, in North Africa, in the Middle East. Wherever Rome ruled, Roman roads followed. And those roads didn't just connect cities. They connected cultures, spread ideas, and created a unified economic zone that wouldn't be seen again until the modern era. But roads and aqueducts, as impressive as they were just infrastructure. The real genius of Roman technology shows up in the details, in the small innovations that made daily life possible for millions of people. If the Roman Empire had a Tony Stark, it was Hero of Alexandria. Born in the 1st century of the Common Era, Hero was an engineer, mathematician, and inventor whose creations were so far ahead of their time that they seem almost impossible. He lived in Alexandria, the intellectual capital of the Roman world, a city with the greatest library in antiquity, and a tradition of scientific inquiry that stretched back to the Ptolemaic period. And in that environment, Hero created machines that wouldn't be reinvented for over 1,000 years. Let's start with something that sounds like pure magic. Automatic temple doors. Imagine you're a worshiper in ancient Alexandria. You approach a temple and the priest lights a fire on an altar outside the entrance. Slowly, without anyone touching them, the massive bronze doors swing open. To the average person, this would seem like divine intervention, proof that the gods themselves were welcoming them. But it wasn't magic. It was engineering. Hero designed a system that used the heat from the fire to create pressure. Here's how it worked. Beneath the altar was a sealed container filled with water and air. When the fire was lit, it heated the air, causing it to expand. The expanding air pushed the water through a pipe into a second container. As this second container filled with water, it became heavier. The weight pulled it downward. The container was connected by ropes to the door hinges, and as it descended, the ropes turned the hinges, opening the doors. When the fire was extinguished, the air cooled, the pressure dropped, and the water flowed back to the original container through a siphon. The doors slowly closed, and the system reset itself, ready for the next ceremony. This wasn't just a clever trick. This was an understanding of thermodynamics, hydraulics, and mechanical engineering that was centuries ahead of its time. Hero understood that heated air expands, that pressure can be used to move fluids, and that mechanical advantage can turn small forces into large movements. But the automatic doors were just one of his inventions. Hero also created the world's first vending machine. In temples, worshippers would often want to purchase holy water or wine for offerings. Hero designed a device that would automatically dispense a measured amount of liquid when a coin was inserted. The mechanism was beautifully simple. When you dropped a coin into the slot, it would land on a small pan connected to a lever. The weight of the coin would tilt the lever, opening a valve. Liquid would pour out until the coin slid off the pan. The lever returned to its original position, and the valve closed. It was a fully automated transaction, requiring no human intervention, and it wouldn't be reinvented until the 1800s, over 1,700 years later. But Hero's most impressive invention, the one that could have changed the course of history, was the Aeolipile, the world's first steam engine. The Aeolipile was a hollow sphere mounted on a pair of tubes that allowed it to rotate. The tubes were connected to a sealed kettle of water. When the water was heated, steam would rise through the tubes into the sphere. The sphere had two nozzles pointing in opposite directions. As steam escaped through the nozzles, the reaction force would cause the sphere to spin. It was a working steam turbine, demonstrating the principle that would power the Industrial Revolution 1,700 years later. Think about that for a moment. In the 1st century, Hero of Alexandria built a functioning steam engine. He understood that steam pressure could be converted into rotational motion. He had created a device that, with further development, could have powered machinery, pumped water, or driven mills. But it didn't happen. The Romans saw the Iolipile as a curiosity, a clever toy, nothing more. They didn't develop it further. They didn't see its potential to revolutionize industry and transportation. Why not? That's one of history's great questions. Some historians argue that the Romans had no need for labor-saving devices because they had abundant slave labor. Others suggest that the technology wasn't quite ready, that metallurgy and precision manufacturing weren't advanced enough to build reliable steam engines. But the fact remains, Hero of Alexandria came within a hair's breadth of triggering an industrial revolution in the 1st century. If the Romans had pursued his invention, if they had seen its potential and developed it further, the entire course of human history could have been different. Instead, the Aeolipile remained a curiosity, and the steam engine wouldn't be reinvented until Thomas Newcomen built his atmospheric engine in 1712. Hero's other inventions were equally impressive. He created a wind-powered organ, the first known device to use wind power for something other than sailing. He designed a force pump that could fight fires or create fountains. He built automated puppet theaters where mechanical figures would perform entire plays, driven by a system of ropes, weights, and rotating cylinders. He even created a programmable machine, using a system of knots on a rope wrapped around a cylinder. As the cylinder rotated, the knots would trigger different mechanisms at different times, creating a sequence of automated actions. It was, in essence, an early form of programming, using physical knots instead of digital code. Hero wrote extensively about his inventions, and his books survived through the Byzantine period and into the Islamic Golden Age. Arab scholars studied his work, translated it, and built upon his ideas. Some of his inventions influenced the development of medieval technology in the Islamic world, and eventually in Europe. But in the immediate aftermath of Rome's fall, most of his innovations were forgotten. The automatic doors stopped opening. The vending machines fell into disrepair. The Aeolipile became a legend, a story about ancient wonders that seemed too advanced to be real. It wasn't until the Renaissance, when scholars began rediscovering ancient texts, that Hero's genius was recognized again. And even then, it took centuries before his inventions were fully understood and appreciated. Today, Hero of Alexandria is recognized as one of the greatest engineers of antiquity. But he should be more than that. He should be remembered as a man who nearly changed the world, who stood at the threshold of an industrial revolution and showed humanity what was possible. The Romans had the knowledge, the skills, and the resources to transform Hero's inventions into world-changing technology. They chose not to. And that choice, that missed opportunity, is one of the great what-ifs of history. When we think of factories, we think of the Industrial Revolution. Smokestacks, assembly lines, mass production. We think of the 1800s, of Manchester and Birmingham, of steam power and mechanization. But the Romans built factories, real, functioning, industrial-scale production facilities, over 1,000 years before the word factory even existed. In the south of France, near the modern city of Arles, archaeologists discovered something extraordinary: the remains of a massive flour mill complex. Not a single mill, not a small operation. A complex of 16 water wheels, arranged in a carefully engineered sequence, capable of producing up to 25 tons of flour every single day. 25 tons. Every day. That's enough to feed tens of thousands of people. This wasn't a village mill where a farmer would bring his grain to be ground. This was industrial-scale food production, a factory in every sense of the word. The complex was built on a hillside, with water channeled from 2 aqueducts. The water would flow downhill, turning the first wheel, then continuing to the next, and the next, in a carefully designed cascade. Each wheel powered a set of millstones inside a building, grinding grain into flour. The system was brilliant in its efficiency. The same water powered all 16 wheels, and the gradient was calculated to ensure each wheel received enough flow to operate at optimal speed. Workers would pour grain into the millstones, collect the flour, and transport it to the city. It took an estimated 30 people to run the entire operation. 30 people producing 25 tons of flour per day. That's over 800 kilograms per worker, Even by modern standards, that's impressive productivity. But this wasn't the only example of Roman industrial production. Throughout the empire, there's evidence of large-scale manufacturing operations. In Britain, archaeologists have found the remains of pottery factories that produced thousands of identical vessels using standardized molds. In Spain, there were fish sauce factories producing garum, a fermented fish condiment that was wildly popular throughout the Roman world. These facilities processed tons of fish, using large vats and a production process that took months. In the eastern provinces, there were textile factories, glass-making workshops, and metalworking facilities that operated on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the late medieval period. The Romans understood mass production. They understood standardization, quality control, and supply chain management. They built facilities designed for efficiency, with workers specializing in specific tasks, raw materials flowing in, and finished products flowing out. And they did it all without steam power, without electricity, without any of the technology we associate with industrialization. They used water power, human labor, and clever engineering to create production systems that could feed, clothe, and equip millions of people. The Barbagal Mill Complex is particularly impressive because it shows sophisticated understanding of mechanical engineering. The water wheels weren't just simple paddle wheels. They were carefully designed to maximize power transfer, with the right diameter, the right number of paddles, and the right gearing to turn the millstones at the optimal speed. The buildings themselves were designed for efficiency: grain storage on the upper floors, milling on the main floor, and flour collection at the bottom. Gravity did much of the work, moving materials through the production process with minimal human effort. This kind of systematic thinking, this approach to production as an engineering problem to be solved, is what we associate with the Industrial Revolution. But the Romans were doing it in the 2nd century. So why didn't this lead to a full industrial revolution? Why didn't the Romans develop steam power, mechanize production, and transform their economy the way Britain did in the 1700s? That's a complex question, with no simple answer. Part of it was economic. The Romans had access to abundant labor, both free and enslaved, which reduced the incentive to develop labor-saving machinery. Part of it was technological. They lacked precision metalworking, reliable power sources beyond water and animals, and the scientific understanding of thermodynamics that would make steam power practical. But part of it was also cultural. The Romans valued tradition, stability, and proven methods. Innovation was respected, but radical change was viewed with suspicion. The social structure of the empire, with its rigid class divisions and reliance on slavery, didn't encourage the kind of economic disruption that industrialization brings. Still, the fact remains that the Romans came remarkably close. They had factories, mass production, and sophisticated engineering. They had inventors like Hero who understood the principles of steam power. They had the organizational skills and the resources to implement new technologies on a massive scale. They stood at the threshold of an industrial revolution and chose not to cross it. And when the empire fell, the knowledge and infrastructure that made these factories possible fell with it. The Barbagal Mill Complex was abandoned. The water wheels stopped turning. The buildings crumbled. And for over 1,000 years, Europe wouldn't see industrial-scale production again. When we think of ancient technology, we tend to imagine crude tools, rough craftsmanship, and simple designs. We picture blacksmiths hammering iron, carpenters sawing wood, and stonemasons chipping away at blocks of marble. But the Romans were capable of precision work that seems almost impossible without modern machinery. In 2023, a German archaeologist named Constantin Frerid made a discovery that changed our understanding of Roman craftsmanship. In a field in Peter and Friel, about 3 hours south of Hamburg, he found a lock. But this wasn't just any lock. It was a Roman lock, made of gold, and it was smaller than a Coca-Cola bottle cap. Let me repeat that. A fully functioning lock, with an internal mechanism made of gold, smaller than a bottle cap, created 2,000 years ago without power tools, without magnification, without any of the precision equipment we take for granted. The lock was still mostly intact. You could see how it worked. Insert a key, turn it, and the internal mechanism would release a chain. It operated on the same principle as a modern padlock, with pins that had to be aligned correctly for the lock to open. but the scale was astonishing. The entire mechanism, including the keyhole, the pins, and the release mechanism, fit into a space smaller than your thumb. The craftsmanship was so precise that the lock still functioned after 1,600 years underground. This tells us something important about Roman metalworking. They had the skills, the tools, and the knowledge to work at a level of precision that we associate with watchmakers and jewelers. They could create tiny, intricate mechanisms that required perfect alignment and smooth operation. And this wasn't a one-off. The lock was likely used on a small chest or jewelry box, which means there was a market for such items. Wealthy Romans wanted secure containers for their valuables, and craftsmen could provide them with locks that were both beautiful and functional. The key itself, though not found with the lock, would have been equally impressive. It would have needed to fit perfectly into the tiny keyhole and align the internal pins with precision. Creating such a key without modern measuring tools or precision machinery required incredible skill. Roman locksmiths were masters of their craft. They understood the principles of mechanical security, the properties of different metals, and the techniques needed to create complex mechanisms at small scales. But locks weren't the only example of Roman precision work. Throughout the empire, archaeologists have found evidence of sophisticated craftsmanship in various fields. Roman glassmakers could create vessels so thin and delicate that they seem impossible for ancient technology. They understood how to control temperature, how to blow glass into molds, and how to create colors using different metal oxides. Some Roman glass is so fine that it rivals modern crystal. Roman jewelers could work with gold, silver, and precious stones at a level that wouldn't be matched until the Renaissance. They created intricate filigree work, tiny granules of gold arranged in complex patterns, and settings that held gemstones securely while displaying them beautifully. Roman instrument makers created surgical tools that were remarkably sophisticated. Scalpels, forceps, bone saws, and other medical instruments have been found in archaeological sites throughout the empire. These tools were made with precision, designed for specific purposes, and crafted from high-quality steel. The Romans even created precision measuring instruments. They had rulers marked in tiny increments, calipers for measuring thickness, and levels for ensuring surfaces were flat. They understood the importance of accurate measurement and created tools that allowed craftsmen to work with precision. All of this required not just skill, but knowledge. Roman craftsmen understood metallurgy, the properties of different alloys, and how to heat-treat metals to achieve the right hardness and flexibility. They understood optics well enough to create magnifying lenses, though these were rare and expensive. They had developed techniques for precision casting, creating molds that could produce identical objects with minimal variation. They understood quality control, with master craftsmen inspecting work and rejecting pieces that didn't meet standards. This culture of precision extended beyond luxury goods. Roman military equipment was standardized and manufactured to exacting specifications. A legionary's sword, the gladius, had to be a specific length, weight, and balance. Armor had to fit properly and provide reliable protection. Shields had to be uniform in size and construction. This standardization allowed the Roman military to equip and maintain legions across the empire. A soldier in Britain could receive replacement equipment that was identical to what he'd trained with in Italy. Spare parts were interchangeable. Maintenance was simplified. The same principle applied to construction. Roman bricks were made in standard sizes. Pipes came in standard diameters. Building components were designed to fit together in predictable ways. This allowed for efficient construction and easy repairs. The Romans understood something that would be forgotten in medieval Europe and rediscovered during the Industrial Revolution. Standardization and precision make everything easier. They make production more efficient, maintenance simpler, and quality more consistent. When the empire fell, much of this precision work was lost. Medieval craftsmen could still create beautiful objects, but the level of standardization and the culture of precision measurement declined. It wasn't until the Renaissance that European craftsmen began to rediscover these principles. Today, when we look at that tiny golden lock, we're not just seeing a beautiful artifact. We're seeing evidence of a sophisticated technological culture, one that valued precision, understood mechanical principles, and had the skills to create objects that still impress us 2,000 years later. Time is something we take for granted. We glance at our phones, check our watches, and know exactly what hour, minute, and second it is. We schedule our lives down to the minute, coordinating meetings, appointments, and activities with precision. But for most of human history, time was vague. You knew it was morning or afternoon, that the sun was high or low, but exact hours, that was difficult. The Romans, like other ancient civilizations, used sundials. These worked well enough during the day when the sun was shining. A vertical stick, called a gnomon, would cast a shadow on a marked surface, and you could read the approximate time from the shadow's position. But sundials had obvious limitations. They didn't work at night. They didn't work on cloudy days. And they weren't very precise, especially in northern latitudes where the sun's path varied dramatically with the seasons. The solution came from an earlier civilization, but the Romans adopted and improved it: the water clock, or clepsydra. The principle was simple. Water flows at a consistent rate. If you have a container with a small hole in the bottom, water will drip out steadily. By measuring how much water has drained, you can measure how much time has passed. But making this work reliably was far from simple. The problem is that water pressure changes as the container empties. When the container is full, the pressure is high, and water flows faster. As it empties, the pressure drops, and the flow slows down. Early water clocks tried to compensate for this by using specially shaped containers, wider at the top than at the bottom, so that the changing water level would balance out the changing pressure. But this was imprecise and required constant calibration. Then came Ctesibius, a Greek inventor working in Alexandria before the Roman period. He revolutionized water clock design with a brilliant innovation: the constant level reservoir. Instead of measuring time by how much water drained from a single container, Ctesibius used two containers. The first was kept constantly full, with excess water overflowing into a drain. This maintained constant pressure, ensuring that water flowed into the second container at a steady rate. In the second container, a float rose with the water level. The float was connected to a pointer that moved along a marked scale, indicating the time. As the day progressed, the float rose, and the pointer moved, showing the hours. But Ctesibius didn't stop there. He understood that the length of daylight changes with the seasons. In summer, days are longer. In winter, they're shorter. A simple water clock would show the same 12 hours regardless of the season, which didn't match how Romans actually divided their days. So Ctesibius made his clock adjustable. The scale that showed the hours wasn't fixed. Instead, it was mounted on a rotating cylinder. At the end of each day, when the float reached the top, the excess water would trigger a siphon, draining the second container and resetting the clock. But here's the clever part. That same water would flow over a small water wheel. The wheel was connected through a series of gears to the cylinder with the time scale. Each day, the cylinder would rotate slightly, adjusting the scale to account for the changing length of daylight. This meant the clock automatically adjusted for the seasons. In summer, when days were longer, the scale would stretch the hours. In winter, when days were shorter, it would compress them. The clock always showed the correct time according to Roman timekeeping conventions. This was an incredibly sophisticated piece of engineering. It required understanding of hydraulics, gearing, and the astronomical principles that govern the changing seasons. It required precision manufacturing to create gears that would mesh properly and a siphon that would trigger at exactly the right moment. And it worked. Ctesibius's water clocks were used throughout the Roman world. They were installed in public places, allowing citizens to know the time even on cloudy days or at night. They were used in law courts to time speeches, ensuring that lawyers didn't exceed their allotted time. They were used in military camps to coordinate watch changes. The Romans improved on Ctesibius's design, adding decorative elements and additional features. Some water clocks included moving figures, bells that rang at certain hours, or even mechanical birds that sang. One particularly elaborate water clock, described by the Roman architect Vitruvius, included a rotating sphere that showed the phases of the moon and the positions of the planets. It was part timepiece, part astronomical calculator, demonstrating the Romans' understanding of celestial mechanics. These clocks were expensive and required skilled maintenance, so they weren't common in private homes. But in public spaces, In temples, in government buildings, they provided a level of time-keeping precision that wouldn't be matched until the development of mechanical clocks in medieval Europe. And even then, early mechanical clocks weren't necessarily more accurate than well-maintained water clocks. It wasn't until the invention of the pendulum clock in the 1600s that mechanical timekeeping clearly surpassed water-based systems. The Romans understood that time was valuable. They understood that coordinating activities, managing schedules, and measuring durations required accurate timekeeping. And they developed the technology to make it possible. When the empire fell, many of these sophisticated water clocks were lost or fell into disrepair. The knowledge of how to build and maintain them declined. Medieval Europe relied more on sundials and simple hourglasses, with less precision and less sophistication. It wasn't until the Islamic Golden Age that water clock technology was revived and further developed. Arab engineers studied the ancient texts, including descriptions of Ctesibius's clocks, and created even more elaborate designs. Eventually, this knowledge made its way back to Europe, influencing the development of mechanical clocks. But for centuries, the Romans had possessed timekeeping technology that was lost to the medieval world. Imagine living in a world without central heating. Every winter, you'd huddle around a fireplace or brazier, trying to stay warm. The room with the fire would be hot, almost unbearably so, while the rest of your house remained freezing. You'd go to bed wearing layers of clothing, piling on blankets, and still wake up cold. This was reality for most of human history. It was reality in medieval Europe. It was reality in colonial America. It was reality until the development of modern heating systems in the 1900s. But it wasn't reality in Rome. The Romans invented central heating. They called it the hypocaust, and it was one of the most significant improvements in quality of life that the ancient world ever achieved. The principle was elegant. Instead of heating a room directly with a fire, you'd heat the floor. Warm air would rise from below, heating the entire space evenly and comfortably. Here's how it worked. The floor of a room wasn't built directly on the ground. Instead, it was raised on small pillars, creating a space underneath. This space, the hypocaust, was connected to a furnace, usually located outside the building. The furnace would burn wood or charcoal, creating hot air and smoke. This would flow into the hypocaust, spreading under the entire floor. The heat would radiate upward, warming the floor and, by extension, the room above. But the Romans didn't stop there. They also built hollow spaces into the walls, allowing hot air to rise through them. This meant the walls were warm too, creating an envelope of heat around the room. The smoke and cooled air would eventually exit through vents in the roof, creating a draft that pulled fresh hot air from the furnace. The system was self-regulating. As long as the furnace was kept burning, the room would stay warm. The effect was remarkable. Roman bathhouses, which used hypocaust heating extensively, could maintain comfortable temperatures even in the depths of winter. The floors were warm enough to walk on barefoot, but not so hot that they were uncomfortable. The air was warm and dry without the stuffiness and smoke of a traditional fireplace. Wealthy Romans installed hypocausts in their private homes, particularly in the colder provinces of the empire. In Britain, in Germany, in the Balkans, Roman villas had heated floors, providing a level of comfort that wouldn't be seen again in those regions for over 1,000 years. The system required careful engineering. The floor had to be strong enough to support the weight of people and furniture, while being thin enough to allow heat to pass through. The pillars had to be spaced correctly to allow air to flow freely. The furnace had to be sized appropriately for the space being heated. Roman engineers understood heat transfer, airflow, and structural engineering well enough to make all of this work. They experimented with different designs, different materials, and different configurations to optimize performance. Some hypocausts used terracotta pipes instead of hollow walls, creating a more controlled path for the hot air. Some used multiple furnaces to heat large spaces more evenly. Some included adjustable vents to control the temperature in different rooms. The fuel consumption was significant. Keeping a hypocaust running required a steady supply of wood or charcoal, which meant that only the wealthy could afford to heat their entire homes this way. But public bathhouses, which were subsidized by the government or wealthy patrons, made hypocaust heating available to everyone. And Romans loved their baths. Bathhouses weren't just places to get clean. They were social centers, places to relax, exercise, and meet friends. A typical bathhouse would have multiple rooms at different temperatures: the frigidarium, cold room, the tepidarium, warm room, and the caldarium, hot room. The caldarium, heated by a hippocaust, could be incredibly hot, like a modern sauna. Romans would sit in the heat, sweating, then scrape their skin with a curved tool called a strigil to remove dirt and dead skin. Then they'd move to cooler rooms, perhaps take a swim in a cold pool, and emerge feeling refreshed and clean. This bathing culture, enabled by hippocaust technology, was one of the defining features of Roman civilization. It promoted hygiene, health, and social interaction. It was so important that even small towns would have at least one public bathhouse. When the empire fell, the hippocaust system was largely abandoned. The infrastructure required to maintain it, the steady supply of fuel, the skilled workers who could repair and operate the furnaces, all of this disappeared. Medieval Europeans returned to simpler heating methods: fireplaces, braziers, and layers of clothing. The idea of a warm floor, of a room heated evenly and comfortably, became a distant memory. It wasn't until the 1800s that central heating began to be redeveloped in Europe and America. Early systems used steam or hot water circulating through pipes, a different technology than the Roman hippocaust, but serving the same purpose. Today we take central heating for granted. We adjust our thermostats without thinking about it. But for the Romans, creating a warm, comfortable indoor environment in the middle of winter was a significant technological achievement, one that improved quality of life in a fundamental way. When we talk about the fall of Rome, we usually focus on the political and military aspects: the barbarian invasions, the division of the empire, the sack of Rome itself. We talk about the end of an era, the beginning of the Dark Ages. But there's another story, equally important and far more tragic: the loss of knowledge. The Romans didn't just build impressive structures. They accumulated centuries of engineering knowledge, scientific understanding, and practical expertise. They wrote it down in books, taught it in schools, and passed it from master to apprentice. And then, over the course of a few centuries, most of it vanished. Libraries were destroyed, schools closed. The economic system that supported scholars and engineers collapsed. The trade networks that allowed the exchange of ideas broke down. And gradually, the knowledge that had taken centuries to accumulate was forgotten. Let's take concrete as an example. We've already discussed how Roman concrete was superior to modern concrete in many ways, particularly its self-healing properties. But after the fall of Rome, the formula was lost. Medieval builders tried to recreate Roman concrete. They mixed lime and sand, added water, and hoped for the best. But they didn't know about the volcanic ash. They didn't know about hot mixing. They didn't understand the chemistry that made Roman concrete special. The result was inferior concrete that crumbled and failed. So medieval builders largely abandoned concrete and returned to stone and brick construction. It wasn't until the 1700s that concrete began to be used again in Europe, and even then it was a different formula, based on different principles. The same thing happened with other technologies. The hippocaust heating system was forgotten. Medieval castles and manor houses were cold, drafty places, heated only by fireplaces that were inefficient and smoky. The comfort that Romans had enjoyed 1,000 years earlier was gone. The sophisticated water supply and sewage systems that Roman cities had relied on fell into disrepair. Medieval cities drew water from wells and rivers, often contaminated with sewage. Disease spread. Life expectancy dropped. The road network, once maintained by the imperial government, deteriorated. Without regular repairs, the carefully engineered surfaces broke down. Drainage ditches filled with debris, bridges collapsed, travel became slower, more dangerous, and more expensive. The cursus publicus, the imperial post system, disappeared. There was no longer a centralized government with the resources and authority to maintain it. Messages moved more slowly. Information became localized. The sense of being part of a vast, interconnected empire faded. Even simple technologies were lost. The Romans had developed efficient water mills for grinding grain. These fell out of use in many areas, and people returned to hand-grinding grain with stone querns, a much more labor-intensive process. The knowledge of how to make glass, particularly high-quality clear glass, declined. Medieval glass was often thick, bubbly, and tinted. The thin, clear glass that Romans had used for windows and vessels wasn't produced again until the Renaissance. Medical knowledge suffered particularly badly. Roman physicians, building on Greek medical texts, had developed a sophisticated understanding of anatomy, surgery, and treatment. They had surgical instruments, understood the importance of cleanliness, and could perform complex operations. Much of this knowledge was lost in Western Europe. Medieval medicine relied more on herbal remedies and prayer than on the systematic approach that Roman physicians had used. Surgery was often performed by barbers rather than trained physicians. Medical education declined. Why did this happen? How could so much knowledge simply disappear? Part of the answer is economic. The Roman Empire had been wealthy enough to support a class of scholars, engineers, and craftsmen who could dedicate their lives to learning and innovation. When the economy collapsed, this support disappeared. People focused on survival, not on preserving ancient texts or maintaining complex technologies. Part of it was political. The centralized Roman government had funded public works, maintained infrastructure, and supported education. When that government fragmented into competing kingdoms, there was no longer anyone with the resources or authority to maintain these systems. Part of it was cultural. The Germanic tribes that settled in the former Roman territories had their own traditions and technologies. They weren't necessarily interested in preserving Roman knowledge, and the Romans who remained often lacked the resources or motivation to maintain the old ways. But perhaps the biggest factor was the loss of literacy. Roman civilization had been built on written knowledge. Engineers consulted texts by Vitruvius and Hero. Physicians studied Galen. Architects referenced pattern books. This written tradition allowed knowledge to be preserved and transmitted across generations. In the chaos of the 5th and 6th centuries, literacy rates plummeted. Books were expensive, and with the economy in ruins, fewer people could afford them. Schools closed. The tradition of copying and preserving texts weakened. The Christian Church became the primary preserver of literacy and learning. Monasteries maintained libraries and scriptoria where monks copied texts. But the Church was primarily interested in religious texts. Classical works on engineering, science, and technology were lower priority. Some texts survived, some knowledge was preserved, but much was lost, and what remained was often fragmentary and poorly understood. It wasn't until the Islamic Golden Age that much of this knowledge was recovered. Arab scholars translated Greek and Roman texts into Arabic, studied them, and built upon them. They preserved works that had been lost in Europe and added their own innovations. Eventually, during the Renaissance, these texts made their way back to Europe, often translated from Arabic back into Latin. European scholars rediscovered the works of Vitruvius, Hero, and other Roman engineers. They began to understand what had been lost and to rebuild on those foundations. But the gap was real. For roughly 1,000 years, from the 5th century to the 15th, Europe lacked much of the technological sophistication that Rome had possessed. It was a genuine dark age in terms of engineering and applied science. And the tragedy is that it didn't have to happen. The knowledge existed. It was written down. If the political and economic conditions had been different, if there had been more stability, more resources, more interest in preservation, much more could have been saved. Instead, humanity had to relearn lessons that had already been learned, reinvent technologies that had already been invented, and rediscover principles that had already been discovered. The fall of Rome wasn't just the end of an empire. It was the loss of a technological civilization, and it set human progress back by centuries. So here we are, 2,000 years later, living in a world of smartphones, space stations, and artificial intelligence. We've split the atom, mapped the human genome, and sent robots to Mars. Surely we've left the Romans far behind, right? Not entirely. Walk through any modern city, and you'll see Roman influence everywhere. The concrete in the buildings, the sewers under the streets, the aqueducts that still carry water in some European cities. The Romans built infrastructure that has lasted millennia, and in some cases we're still using it. But it's more than just physical structures. The Romans gave us a way of thinking about engineering, about problem solving, about building things that last. They understood that good engineering isn't about flashy innovations or clever tricks. It's about understanding principles, about careful planning, about attention to detail. It's about building things that work, that last, and that serve their purpose efficiently. Modern engineers still study Roman structures, not just as historical curiosities, but as examples of good design. The Pantheon's dome is still analyzed in architecture schools. The principles behind Roman concrete are being incorporated into modern materials. The design of Roman roads influences modern highway engineering. And beyond the technical aspects, there's something else we can learn from the Romans: the value of infrastructure. The Romans understood that a civilization is only as strong as its infrastructure. You can have the best army, the wisest leaders, the most prosperous economy, but if your roads are bad, your water supply is unreliable, and your cities are unsanitary, none of that matters. So they invested heavily in infrastructure. They built roads, aqueducts, sewers, harbors, and public buildings. They maintained them. They improved them. They understood that this was the foundation of everything else. Modern societies sometimes forget this. We take infrastructure for granted. We assume the water will flow when we turn on the tap, that the roads will be there when we need to drive somewhere, that the power grid will keep running. But infrastructure requires constant investment, constant maintenance, constant attention. When we neglect it, when we defer maintenance, when we prioritize short-term savings over long-term sustainability, we're making the same mistake that contributed to Rome's fall. The Romans also understood the importance of standardization and quality control. They built to standards. They used standardized components. They ensured that construction met minimum quality requirements. This allowed them to build quickly and efficiently across a vast empire. A bridge built in Spain used the same principles and techniques as a bridge built in Syria. This consistency made maintenance easier, made training simpler, and ensured reliability. Modern industry has rediscovered these principles. We have standards organizations, quality control processes, and interchangeable parts. But the Romans understood this 2,000 years ago. Perhaps most importantly, the Romans showed us what's possible when a society commits to technological progress. They didn't just accept the world as it was. They looked for ways to improve it, to solve problems, to make life better. They saw a city that needed water, and they built aqueducts. They saw buildings that were cold, and they invented central heating. They saw the need for better roads, and they engineered a highway system that lasted centuries. They weren't content with good enough. They pushed for better, for more efficient, for more sophisticated. And in doing so, they created a technological civilization that was unmatched for over 1,000 years. Today, we face our own challenges: climate change, resource depletion, infrastructure decay, technological disruption. The problems are different, but the need for innovative solutions is the same. We can learn from the Romans, not by copying their specific technologies, which are often outdated, but by adopting their mindset, their commitment to solving problems, their willingness to invest in long-term infrastructure, their understanding that technology should serve society, making life better for everyone. The Roman Empire fell. The political structure collapsed. The economic system broke down. But the legacy of Roman engineering lives on, in the structures that still stand, in the principles that still guide us, in the understanding that human ingenuity, properly applied, can overcome enormous challenges. We stand on the shoulders of giants. The Romans were among the tallest of those giants. They showed us what's possible. They left us a blueprint for building a technological civilization. It's up to us to learn from their successes, to avoid their mistakes, and to build something even better. Because that's what they would have wanted. The Romans weren't content to rest on past achievements. They were always looking forward, always building, always improving. And 2,000 years later, their concrete still stands, their aqueducts still flow, and their legacy still inspires. That's the secret technology that built the Roman Empire. Not any single invention, but a culture of engineering excellence, a commitment to infrastructure, and an understanding that technology, properly applied, can change the world. The Romans changed their world. They built an empire that lasted centuries and influenced everything that came after. Now it's our turn, and that's where we'll leave it tonight. The Roman Empire, an empire built not just on military might or political genius, but on technology, on concrete that heals itself, on aqueducts that defy gravity, on roads that connected a continent, on innovations that were so far ahead of their time that we're still trying to catch up. The Romans showed us what's possible when human ingenuity is unleashed, when problems are met with solutions, when a civilization commits to building something that lasts. Their empire fell, but their legacy endures. In every concrete building, in every mile of highway, in every city water system, the Romans are still with us. And maybe that's the real secret. Not any single technology, but the understanding that we can build a better world, that we can solve problems, that we can create things that outlast us. The Romans did it 2,000 years ago, and their work still stands, still functions, still inspires. What will we build that lasts 2,000 years? Thanks for watching. Until next time, sleep well.